On a bright April morning in 2025, the people of Sedalia, Arizona awoke to headlines that stopped them cold. Local news outlets, radios, and phones buzzed with the same breaking story: arrest made in 25-year-old Arizona cold case, community in shock. The victim's name, Marissa Talcott, had almost become a faded memory. But in an instant, it was on every tongue again. In coffee shops, schools, and church gatherings, people whispered her story as though it had happened yesterday. For many in Sedalia, the name brought back a deep ache, a wound that had never healed. Marissa was just 25 when her life was taken in the year 2000. She had been bright, ambitious, and filled with dreams, the kind of person people described as light in human form. Her murder devastated her family, her parents Helen and David Talcott, her younger brother Evan, and the friends who loved her dearly. And yet, despite the endless hours of police work, her case went unsolved. For more than 2 decades, it remained a cold case, buried in dusty files, revisited only when anniversaries or whispers stirred the town's memory. People grew older, life moved on, but justice never came. Until now. At 6 a.m. on April 12, 2025, officers from the Arizona Department of Public Safety, alongside Sedalia police, surrounded a modest house on the edge of town. Inside lived Graham Kessler, a man in his mid-40s who had built a seemingly ordinary life. Neighbors knew him as polite, quiet, and hardworking. Some even trusted him to watch their kids or lend a hand fixing fences. But beneath that calm exterior lay a dark truth. Kessler had been living freely for 25 years while the Talcott family endured birthdays without Marissa, holidays with an empty chair, and endless nights of unanswered questions. The moment of his arrest shook the community to its core. How could someone like him have hidden among us all this time? Back in the summer of 2000, Detective Raymond Calderon was among the first investigators to handle Marissa's case. At the time, Sedalia was a growing town but still small enough that everyone knew everyone. Calderon remembered Marissa as a girl who didn't deserve anything but the best. But the evidence in 2000 was thin. Witness accounts conflicted. Forensic tools were limited. What DNA evidence existed was considered inconclusive by the standards of the time. Despite weeks of relentless investigation, the case ran dry. Leads turned into dead ends. Suspects were questioned, then released. And eventually, the case was filed away as one of Sedalia's unsolved tragedies. For her parents, Helen and David, the silence was unbearable. Every year, Helen lit a candle on Marissa's birthday. David kept his daughter's car parked in their driveway for years, unable to part with it. Her younger brother Evan grew up carrying the weight of loss, forever defined as Marissa's brother. As the years passed, Sedalia changed. New businesses opened, families moved in, and children born the year of Marissa's murder grew up never knowing her name. But for those who had lived through it, the memory lingered. In quiet conversations, people still asked each other, "Do you think they'll ever catch him?" Meanwhile, Graham Kessler went about his life. He worked odd jobs, moved houses a few times, and eventually settled back into Sedalia. To most, he seemed ordinary. No one could have guessed he was the very man police had hunted for in 2000. The turning point came when Detective Lila Moreno, a determined cold case investigator, reopened Marissa's file in 2023. With advances in DNA technology, Moreno believed there was still a chance. She combed through the evidence, looking at every scrap that had once been dismissed as too weak or inconclusive. A single DNA fragment, stored carefully for decades, was tested with today's technology. This time it yielded a match. The result pointed directly to Graham Kessler. From there, the pieces began to fall into place. Surveillance records, old witness statements, and background checks were re-examined, each now aligning with the DNA evidence. Moreno's persistence had cracked open a case that many thought would remain unsolved forever. The day of Kessler's arrest, neighbors stood outside their homes, stunned. Some shook their heads in disbelief. "I never would have guessed," said one woman who lived next door. Others expressed guilt. Had they overlooked something? Could Marissa's life have been saved if someone had spoken up? For the Talcott family, the news was bittersweet. Helen wept openly, telling reporters, "I prayed for this day, but I never thought I'd live to see it." David stood beside her, his voice breaking as he said, "Justice has been delayed but not denied." This case is not just about crime. It is about perseverance, grief, and the power of modern justice. It is about a family that never gave up, detectives who refused to let the file gather dust, and a community that learned evil can hide in plain sight. It is also about closure, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that finally allows wounds to begin healing. In the chapters that follow, We will trace Marissa Talcott's story from the vibrant young woman she was in 2000, to the tragedy that took her life, the failed investigation, the long years of silence, and finally, the breakthrough that brought her killer to light. This will not be an easy story. It is one of heartbreak, resilience, and ultimately justice. But it is a story that deserves to be told, because behind the statistics and the headlines, there was a real woman whose life mattered. And so we begin with the memory of Marissa Talcott and the community of Sedalia, Arizona, forever changed by her loss and by the long road to justice. Before she became the name in headlines and a face on posters, Marissa Talcott was simply a young woman chasing dreams in the Arizona desert. Born in 1975 to Helen and David Talcott, she grew up in Sedalia, a town where neighbors waved from porches and high school football games were the highlight of Friday nights. Marissa was the eldest of two children, with a younger brother, Evan, who was just 17 when tragedy struck. Their bond was strong, more like confidants than siblings. She often helped him with homework, gave him advice about girls, and teased him about his habit of sneaking cookies before dinner. To Evan, Marissa was not just a sister, she was a role model, a steady presence he could always rely on. Friends often described Marissa as the type of person who could walk into a room and instantly change its atmosphere. She had a quiet confidence, paired with a warmth that made others feel safe in her presence. Her best friend, Tanya Whitford, once recalled, "Marissa didn't just listen, she heard you. She made you feel like your words mattered." She loved music, particularly the soft acoustic ballads that played on late-night radio stations. She was known to carry a small notebook everywhere, scribbling down lyrics, thoughts, or little sketches of flowers she admired. Her creative spirit seemed limitless. Marissa was also ambitious. She had studied nursing at a community college and was working at Sedalia Medical Clinic as a nurse's assistant. Her dream was to become a registered nurse, with plans to continue her studies in Phoenix. Those who knew her often said she had a gift for caring, not just in her work but in her life. She volunteered at church events, helped elderly neighbors with groceries, and always found time to call her grandmother every Sunday evening. At the turn of the new millennium, Marissa was in a promising chapter of her life. She was 25, independent, and had just moved into her own small apartment near downtown Sedalia. Her parents supported her fully, proud of how she was carving her path. Financially, things were not easy. Nursing school was expensive, and working part-time at the clinic did not cover everything. But Marissa was determined. She took on extra shifts, babysat for friends, and even sold handmade crafts at local fairs to save money. Her social life was modest but fulfilling. She had a small circle of close friends, Tanya, her childhood companion, and two co-workers from the clinic, Rachel DeLeon and Marta Keene. On weekends, they often gathered at a diner on Main Street, laughing over milkshakes and fries, or watched movies at Tanya's house. Marissa was also quietly dating someone at the time, a young man named Caleb Norris who worked at a nearby hardware store. It was not a serious relationship yet, but it was enough to make her smile when she talked about him. According to Tanya, Marissa was cautious about love, preferring to take her time rather than rush into commitments. Helen and David Talcott often spoke of their daughter with glowing pride. David, a retired construction worker, admired her work ethic. "She was tougher than most men I knew," he once said. "If she wanted something, she didn't wait for it, she worked for it." Helen, who worked part-time at a library, treasured the evenings when Marissa stopped by after work. They would cook dinner together, laugh about small things, and talk about Marissa's future plans. Helen recalled how her daughter dreamed not just of nursing but of traveling one day, perhaps volunteering with medical missions abroad. "She wanted to help people everywhere, not just here," Helen said. That was Marissa, always thinking beyond herself. Sometimes it is the smallest details that make a person unforgettable. For Marissa, it was the way she twirled her hair when she was deep in thought, the way she always carried peppermints in her purse for emergencies, and her quirky habit of naming her houseplants. She had a fern she called George and a cactus she jokingly called Needles. She also loved the Arizona sunsets. Often, she would drive just outside of town to watch the sky turn crimson and gold against the desert horizon. To her, it was a reminder of beauty in the everyday, a moment of peace in a busy world. In early 2000, Marissa had begun applying to nursing programs in Phoenix. She had told Tanya she wanted to move there within the year. "It feels like the right time," she had said. She imagined herself living in a small apartment, balancing classes with work, maybe even adopting a dog. Her future was wide open, filled with possibilities. She spoke often about wanting a family one day, though she admitted she was in no rush. For now, her focus was on building a career, helping others, and exploring the world. But all of those dreams, the travel, the nursing degree, the dog she wanted to adopt, were stolen from her on a night that would forever alter her family and community. Looking back, those who knew Marissa often replay the weeks leading up to her death. Were there signs? Did she mention anything unusual? Some recalled that she seemed slightly distracted in her final days, though she brushed it off as stress from extra shifts at work. Others remembered seeing her argue quietly with someone at the diner, though details were vague. At the time, no one thought much of it. She was young, busy, and had a lot on her plate. But in hindsight, every detail feels heavy with meaning. Marissa's story before the tragedy is more than background. It is a portrait of a woman full of love, hope, and determination. She was not a statistic or just another victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. And it is that life, vibrant, beautiful, and full of promise, that makes what happened next so devastating. April 18, 2000 began like any other day in Sedalia, Arizona. The desert town was already warming under the spring sun by mid-morning, the streets alive with the usual bustle, families heading to school, shop owners sweeping sidewalks, and the scent of coffee drifting from the corner diner. For Marissa Talcott, it was just another Tuesday. She had no idea it would be her last. Marissa started the day at her apartment near downtown. She brewed a small pot of coffee, scribbled a few lines in her notebook, something she often did before work, and watered her plants, joking aloud to George the fern and Needles the cactus. She dressed neatly in her scrubs and left for her shift at the Sedalia Medical Clinic. Her co-workers remembered her in unusually good spirits that day. Rachel De Leon, one of her closest colleagues, later recalled, she was humming while she stocked supplies. That was Marissa, always finding a way to bring sunshine into the room. Around noon, she shared lunch with Marta Keene, another co-worker, at the picnic table behind the clinic. They talked about Marta's upcoming wedding and Marissa's plans to apply to nursing schools in Phoenix. Marta would later tell police, she seemed excited about the future. Nothing about her felt off or troubled. After finishing her shift at 3 p.m., Marissa stopped by the Sedalia Public Library to return a stack of books she had borrowed for her studies. Her mother, Helen Talcott, happened to be working her shift there. They shared a brief conversation at the circulation desk. Helen later recounted, tears streaming down her face, she kissed my cheek and said she'd call me later. That was the last time I saw my daughter alive. From the library, Marissa drove to a local grocery store. Receipts showed she bought bread, milk, and a pack of her favorite peppermints. Several witnesses remembered seeing her there, smiling and chatting briefly with the cashier. By early evening, Marissa returned home. Phone records revealed she spoke with Tanya Whitford, her best friend, around 6:30 p.m. Tanya recalled. She asked if I wanted to meet up later in the week. She was tired from her shift, so she said she'd just stay in that night. But something changed. At 7:45 p.m., a neighbor reported seeing Marissa leave her apartment dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, locking the door behind her. No one knew why she went out. She hadn't mentioned plans to anyone. This was the first of several mysteries that baffled investigators. Where was she going and who was she meeting? At 8:10 p.m., a diner employee on Main Street spotted Marissa sitting in a booth across from a man. The employee remembered her looking tense, even uncomfortable. She didn't eat much, only sipping from a glass of water. The man was later described as mid-20s to early 30s, dark hair, wearing a denim jacket. At the time, police could not identify him. Decades later, in 2025, investigators would confirm that man was Graham Kessler, the very suspect eventually arrested for her murder. Witnesses recalled seeing Marissa leave the diner around 8:40 p.m. She appeared to be in a heated conversation with Kessler outside in the parking lot. One witness thought he saw Kessler grab her arm, but the details were too fuzzy to confirm. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marissa alive. When Marissa failed to call her mother that night as promised, Helen grew uneasy. By the next morning, when she did not show up for her shift at the clinic, alarm bells rang. Rachel and Marta both tried calling her, but there was no answer. By noon on April 19th, David Talcott drove to his daughter's apartment. He found her car parked in its usual spot. Inside, the groceries she had bought were still neatly put away. Her purse and keys were missing, but her notebook and half-finished cup of coffee sat on the table. To David, the scene felt wrong. It was like she had just stepped out for a minute and never came back, he told police. The Talcotts reported her missing that afternoon. Police responded quickly. Flyers with Marissa's face appeared around Sedalia within 24 hours. Volunteers, friends, and neighbors joined search parties, combing the desert edges, abandoned lots, and back roads. Her brother Evan walked miles with a flashlight, refusing to give up. But the searches yielded nothing. There were no signs of struggle in her apartment, no witnesses who could clearly describe her last movements after leaving the diner, and no trace of her belongings. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. 4 days later, on April 23, 2000, a group of hikers discovered a body partially concealed in a dry wash about 12 miles outside of town. Authorities quickly confirmed it was Marissa. The news devastated the Talcott family and the Sedalia community. Helen collapsed when officers arrived at her door. David sat in stunned silence, clutching the small silver cross necklace Marissa had given him years before. The autopsy revealed she had been strangled. Bruises on her wrists and arms suggested she had fought desperately to survive. The brutality of the crime shocked everyone. Marissa, who had dedicated her life to helping others, had been taken so violently. Police immediately turned their attention to Marissa's social circle: her boyfriend, her co-workers, her friends. They questioned Caleb Norris, who was cooperative and provided a solid alibi. Tanya, Rachel, and Marta were all interviewed extensively, but none offered leads that pointed to a suspect. The mysterious man from the diner became the primary person of interest, but in 2000, identifying him proved impossible. Witness descriptions were vague and no one could provide a name. Without DNA evidence to link him, police were left with speculation. The case, despite its intensity, began to stall. For her family, the days that followed were unbearable. Helen and David buried their daughter in Sedalia Cemetery, surrounded by hundreds of mourners. Tanya placed Marissa's notebook in the casket, saying softly, "You'll always be writing wherever you are." The community mourned deeply, but beneath the sorrow was fear. If Marissa could be taken, who would be next? Her story faded from the front pages within weeks, replaced by new headlines. But for those who loved her, life was never the same. The discovery of Marissa Talcott's body on April 23, 2000, sent shockwaves through Sedalia. What had started as a missing person case had now turned into a homicide investigation. The Sedalia Police Department, assisted by the Arizona Department of Public Safety, launched one of the largest investigations the small town had ever seen. Detective Raymond Calderon, a seasoned officer with nearly 20 years of experience, was placed in charge. Calderon was known for his persistence and sharp instincts. But even for him, this case would become one of the most haunting of his career. Marissa's body was found in a dry wash about 12 miles outside Sedalia, partially hidden beneath branches and loose dirt. Investigators noted drag marks leading from a dirt road nearby, suggesting her body had been transported. Forensics teams searched the site for hours. They collected fibers from Marissa's clothing, soil samples, and a few partial shoe prints in the sand. They also recovered a discarded cigarette butt near the scene. Back in 2000, DNA technology was still developing. The sample was tested but deemed inconclusive. The autopsy confirmed what police already suspected: Marissa had been strangled. Bruising on her wrists indicated she had been restrained. Defensive wounds on her arms and under her nails showed she fought fiercely. Whoever did this was strong and determined, Calderon later told reporters. Marissa didn't go down without a fight. Investigators began piecing together Marissa's last day. Witnesses confirmed she had been at the diner with an unidentified man between 8 o'clock and 8:40 p.m. That man quickly became the central figure in the investigation. Several witnesses described him as white, mid to late 20s, around 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a denim jacket. Unfortunately, descriptions varied slightly, and none were precise enough to create a strong composite sketch. Police canvassed the diner and surrounding area, but no one recognized the man. He seemed to have vanished as quickly as Marissa. The investigation focused first on people closest to Marissa. Caleb Norris, her boyfriend, was interrogated for hours. He insisted he had been at work that evening, backed by time cards and co-worker statements. Though police considered him a person of interest early on, his alibi held. Tanya Whitford, Marissa's best friend, was cooperative and devastated. She recounted her phone call with Marissa the night she disappeared, insisting Marissa had planned to stay home. Rachel DeLeon and Marta Keene, co-workers, were interviewed extensively. They provided insight into Marissa's work life but offered no leads. David and Helen Talcott were questioned as standard procedure required, but quickly cleared. Despite dozens of interviews, no one could identify the mysterious man from the diner. For the Talcott family, the weeks after Marissa's murder were a blur of grief and frustration. David grew restless, demanding answers that never came. Helen retreated inward, clinging to her daughter's belongings. At one town hall meeting, David stood and addressed Detective Calderon publicly. "You say you're doing everything you can. But my daughter's gone and you still can't tell me who killed her. How do we live with that?" Calderon, though sympathetic, had no good answer. Local newspapers ran constant stories about Marissa's case. Headlines like "Young Nurse's Assistant Murdered" and "Killer Still at Large in Sedalia" dominated front pages. National outlets picked up the story briefly, framing it as another tragic example of violence against young women. The media attention put immense pressure on investigators. But as days turned into weeks, the story faded. By midsummer, other events had replaced it in the news cycle. For the Talcotts, it felt like the world had moved on while their pain remained. Investigators pursued every angle they could. The cigarette butt near the crime scene was tested, but the DNA could not be matched to anyone in the system. The shoe prints near the wash were too partial for identification. Fibers on Marissa's clothing were analyzed but inconclusive. Witnesses from the diner offered conflicting details. Some thought the man had light hair, others swore it was dark. Without solid evidence, the case began to stall. As the investigation dragged on, rumors spread through Sedalia. Some whispered that Marissa's boyfriend Caleb was involved, despite his alibi. Others speculated about strangers passing through town. At one point, police investigated a truck driver seen in the area that night. He was questioned but cleared. Another lead pointed to a former co-worker who had shown an unusual interest in Marissa, but he too was eliminated after providing an airtight alibi. For every potential suspect, the evidence fell apart. By the fall of 2000, momentum had slowed. Detectives Calderon and his team had exhausted every lead. Without DNA evidence strong enough to tie anyone to the crime, the case was left in limbo. In November, the Sedalia police officially classified Marissa's murder as a cold case. The Talcott family was informed in a heartbreaking meeting. Helen later said, "I remember staring at that folder on the detective's desk. It was thick with papers, but inside there were no answers. Just questions." For Calderon, it was a bitter defeat. He admitted privately to colleagues that Marissa's case haunted him more than any other. "I see her face in my sleep," he told a fellow officer. On the first anniversary of Marissa's death in 2001, the Talcott family held a candlelight vigil. Dozens of townspeople attended, holding photos of Marissa and praying for justice. David spoke through tears, "My daughter's story cannot be forgotten. Someone out there knows the truth, and one day we will find it." His words carried a mix of grief and determination. But at that time, few believed the case would ever see resolution. 4 years afterward, Sedalia lived under a quiet cloud of fear. Parents warned their daughters not to go out alone. Women in town carried pepper spray, and people locked their doors earlier at night. Though no other similar crimes occurred, the sense of unease lingered. Marissa's murder became part of the town's lore, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. Children grew up hearing her name as both a tragedy and a warning. By 2002, Detective Calderon was reassigned to other cases. Though Marissa's file remained technically open, it was rarely touched. It sat on a shelf in the evidence room waiting. For the Talcotts, life became a long, painful wait. Helen marked every year with a candlelight vigil. David poured his grief into building a memorial garden in their backyard. Evan, her younger brother, struggled silently, carrying the trauma into adulthood. And somewhere in Sedalia, Graham Kessler, the man who had sat across from Marissa in the diner, walked free, blending into the fabric of the town. After the official announcement in late 2000 that Marissa Talcott's case had gone cold, life in Sedalia, Arizona, did not return to normal. On the surface, the town moved on. Businesses thrived, children grew up, new families moved in, but beneath the everyday routine was a wound that never fully healed. For the Talcott family, every day without justice was another reminder that their daughter's killer walked free. The Talcotts lived in a modest single-story home on the east side of town. After Marissa's death, her absence was felt in every room. Her bedroom remained almost untouched for years, her clothes folded neatly in drawers, her notebooks stacked on the nightstand. Helen Talcott often sat there in silence, running her fingers over her daughter's handwriting. "She was here and then she wasn't," Helen told a local reporter in 2002. "That kind of loss never makes sense." David Talcott, who had always been the pillar of the family, struggled to cope. He spent hours in the small garden out back, planting flowers in Marissa's memory. He built a wooden bench and engraved her name into it, a private place where he could sit and feel close to her. Friends noticed how the once lively, joking David grew quieter, carrying grief like a shadow. For Evan Talcott, only 17 at the time of his sister's murder, the years of silence shaped him profoundly. He avoided conversations about Marissa, burying his pain. But privately, he carried a sense of guilt, telling himself he should have been there to protect her. As he entered adulthood, that guilt hardened into a drive to succeed, to somehow honor the sister he had lost. Every April, on the anniversary of Marissa's death, the Talcott family held a candlelight vigil at the Sedalia town square. The first few years drew crowds, friends, neighbors, even strangers who wanted to show support. Candles flickered against the desert night as people prayed for answers. By the 10th anniversary in 2010, the gatherings had become smaller. Many who once stood beside the Talcotts had moved away or lost hope. Still, Helen and David lit their candles faithfully, refusing to let their daughter be forgotten. For Detective Raymond Calderon, Marissa's case was the one that haunted him most. Though reassigned to other investigations, he never forgot the young woman whose life had been cut short. He kept a photo of her taped inside his desk drawer, a quiet reminder of unfinished business. "I used to dream about solving it," Calderon admitted years later. "Every time the phone rang, I thought, maybe this is the call, maybe this is the break." But the call never came. By 2012, Calderon retired, carrying with him the bitter memory of a case that slipped through his fingers. Sedalia itself evolved. New businesses opened, the population grew, and younger generations knew Marissa's name only through whispers. For them, she was a cautionary tale told by parents. Don't go out alone at night. Remember what happened to that young nurse years ago. The murder left a scar on the town's sense of safety. Even after years passed without another similar crime, a quiet fear lingered. People double-checked their locks and eyed strangers with suspicion. The idea that Marissa's killer had never been caught gnawed at Sedalia's collective memory. Over the years, theories about Marissa's murder became local folklore. Some insisted her boyfriend, Caleb Norris, had somehow fooled the police despite his alibi. Others speculated it was a drifter, someone who had passed through town and disappeared. A more chilling theory gained traction in whispers, that the killer still lived among them. Whenever a new resident behaved oddly or someone seemed secretive, people gossiped. What if it's him? But nothing concrete ever surfaced. The rumor mill only deepened the sense of helplessness. While the Talcotts mourned and the community speculated, Graham Kessler, Marissa's real killer, lived quietly in Sedalia and nearby towns. He changed jobs frequently, construction, mechanic work, seasonal farm labor, never staying long enough in one place to draw attention. To neighbors he seemed ordinary, even helpful. He attended local events, bought groceries at the same stores as everyone else, and blended seamlessly into everyday life. Some even described him as nice. Behind closed doors, however, Kessler carried the weight of his crime. Though he never confessed, those who knew him closely noticed flashes of temper, a guardedness that kept people at arm's length. His ability to live unnoticed for decades would later shock the community even more than his crime itself. By the 2010s, Helen's health began to decline under the strain of grief. She developed insomnia, often staying up late to reread her daughter's old letters and notebooks. She told friends, "If I stop talking about her, it's like she never existed. I can't let that happen." David grew protective of Helen, but he too struggled. He carried bitterness toward the police, the justice system, even toward God. He attended church less, unable to reconcile his faith with what had happened to his daughter. The Talcotts' marriage endured, but their lives revolved around a loss that never faded. As Evan entered adulthood, he carried his sister's memory as motivation. He studied criminal justice at college, inspired by the investigators who had tried to solve Marissa's case. Though he never joined law enforcement directly, he worked in advocacy for victims' families, helping others navigate the same painful uncertainty his family had endured. "Every cold case is a family waiting in the dark," he once said at a conference. "I know because I was one of them." By the 2010s and early 2020s, advances in DNA testing made headlines across the country. Old cases were being solved, killers identified decades after their crimes. Every time a story like that broke, Helen clipped the article and saved it. She brought them to local police, asking, "Can you test Marissa's case again?" For years the answer was the same, "Not yet." But her persistence kept the possibility alive. She refused to believe Marissa's case would remain unsolved forever. By 2020, 20 years had passed since Marissa's murder. Sedalia had largely moved on, though the Talcotts still held their annual vigil. Fewer people attended now, but the candles still flickered each April in the town square. Unknown to most, the tides were about to turn. In 2023, Detective Lila Moreno, a rising star in Arizona's cold case unit, pulled Marissa's file from storage. She would look at the evidence with fresh eyes, equipped with technology that Calderon and his team could only dream of in 2000. The years of silence were ending. By 2023, the Arizona Department of Public Safety had launched a renewed effort to solve long-dormant cases. Across the nation, cold case units were rewriting history with the help of advanced forensic technology. Cases once thought unsolvable were suddenly cracking open as tiny pieces of evidence revealed secrets buried for decades. Among the files sitting in storage was the case of Marissa Talcott, marked with the words Unsolved Homicide 2000. For over 2 decades, the folder had been passed from one detective to another, each unable to make progress. The evidence remained sealed in brown envelopes: fibers, soil samples, cigarette butts, and swabs from Marissa's clothing. It was Detective Lila Moreno who decided to take another look. Lila Moreno was known for her tenacity. At 38, she had already solved 2 other cold cases that had languished for years. She was meticulous, methodical, and unafraid to challenge old assumptions. When she opened Marissa's file in 2023, she felt an immediate pull. Something about her picture, Moreno later said. She looked like someone I could have known. I couldn't let her story end with silence. Unlike the investigators of 2000, Moreno had access to cutting-edge forensic tools, particularly in the field of genetic genealogy, a technique that had revolutionized crime solving by linking DNA to family trees. The first step was to pull the preserved evidence from storage. Moreno requested new testing on the cigarette but found near Marissa's body, as well as DNA collected from beneath her fingernails. Back in 2000, the technology had been too limited to draw strong conclusions. But now, labs could generate detailed genetic profiles from even degraded samples. The results stunned her. The DNA was strong, clear, and belonged to the same individual in both the cigarette butt and under Marissa's nails. This meant one thing: the killer had been at the scene and had struggled with Marissa before strangling her. The next step was to find out who that person was. Moreno partnered with a private lab specializing in genetic genealogy. The DNA profile was uploaded into public genealogy databases, searching for familial matches. Within weeks, hits began to appear, not the killer himself but distant relatives. Through painstaking work, genealogists built out family trees, connecting the DNA to a network of relatives in Arizona and neighboring states. Piece by piece, they narrowed the possibilities until one name stood out: Graham Kessler. The moment Moreno saw the name, her heart raced. Kessler had never been a prime suspect in 2000. His name had surfaced briefly during the initial canvassing. He lived in Sedalia at the time, did odd jobs, and matched the rough description given by diner witnesses. But without hard evidence, police had let him slip through their fingers. Now DNA placed him squarely at the crime scene. Before making an arrest, Moreno needed to confirm the match. In late 2024, undercover officers began discreetly following Kessler, who still lived in Sedalia. He was now in his mid-40s, working as a mechanic at a small auto shop. Outwardly, he appeared ordinary, quiet, polite, and unassuming. But investigators knew otherwise. One evening, officers collected a discarded soda can Kessler had thrown into a public trash bin. The DNA from the can matched perfectly with the profile from Marissa's case. The chain was complete. It was like a ghost suddenly had a face, Moreno said. Moreno dug back into the old reports from 2000. Witnesses at the diner had described a man in his 20s wearing a denim jacket, arguing with Marissa. When she compared the timeline, it all lined up. Kessler would have been 21 at the time. His work records placed him in Sedalia the week of Marissa's disappearance. It was the missing puzzle piece Calderon and his team had needed all those years ago. Now, with DNA evidence, eyewitness accounts gained new strength. By early 2025, Moreno was ready. She built a comprehensive case file: DNA evidence, genealogy reports, witness statements, and timelines. When she presented the findings to the district attorney, Ethan Rowe, he immediately agreed. There was more than enough for an arrest. Rowe, a seasoned prosecutor, understood the gravity of the moment. "Cases like this are why we never stop fighting," he told the press later. Justice delayed does not have to mean justice denied. On April 12, 2025 at 6 a.m., Sedalia residents awoke to the sound of sirens. Officers surrounded Kessler's modest home on the outskirts of town. He was arrested without incident, stunned but silent as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Neighbors stood in shock as they watched the man they had known for years taken away. Some whispered, "I can't believe it," while others muttered, "I always thought he seemed off." For the Talcott family, the news arrived in a phone call from Moreno herself. Helen wept openly, repeating, "Thank you, thank you." David sat silently, gripping the phone, tears streaming down his face. Evan, now in his early 40s, whispered, "Finally." The arrest rocked Sedalia. For 25 years, people had lived with the mystery of Marissa's murder. Now, to learn that the killer had been living quietly among them all along was both shocking and terrifying. Local headlines blared, "Cold case solved after 25 years. Suspect identified as local resident. DNA links Graham Kessler to 2000 murder of Sedalia woman." In interviews, townspeople expressed disbelief. "He fixed my car last year," one man said. "I let him into my house. To think he could do something like this." For Detective Raymond Calderon, now retired, the news brought bittersweet relief. When Moreno visited him to share the arrest, he broke down. "I always knew we missed something," he said. "Thank you for finishing what I couldn't." Moreno gave credit to Calderon's meticulous reports from 2000, which had preserved witness accounts and evidence that later proved vital. "Without his groundwork, we wouldn't have had anything to build on," she said. For the Talcotts, the arrest did not erase the pain, but it finally brought a measure of peace. Helen told reporters, "For 25 years I prayed for this. I wanted to see the man who took my daughter from me held accountable. Now, I believe justice is possible." David, his voice trembling, said, "I don't feel victory. I feel relief. But my little girl is still gone." And Evan added quietly, "It's not closure, but it's the first step toward healing." With Kessler behind bars, the case was no longer a cold file, it was an active prosecution. The arrest marked not the end of the story, but the beginning of the final chapter. The town of Sedalia braced itself for the trial of a man who had hidden in plain sight for a quarter of a century. The silence was over. Justice was finally moving forward. For 25 years, Graham Kessler walked freely through Sedalia and surrounding Arizona towns, all while carrying the darkest of secrets. Outwardly, he was unremarkable, an average man with average habits, blending seamlessly into small-town life. Inwardly, he was the murderer of Marissa Talcott, a crime he buried so deep that even those closest to him never suspected the truth. In 2000, after strangling Marissa and leaving her body in the desert wash, Kessler returned to Sedalia as if nothing had happened. He was only 21 at the time, young enough to be dismissed as just another face in town. In the weeks following Marissa's death, he laid low. He worked odd construction jobs and kept conversations minimal. When police canvassed the area, his name appeared on one list of possible contacts but was quickly crossed off due to lack of evidence. That early oversight allowed him to slip back into obscurity. Privately, Kessler carried paranoia. He avoided the diner where he had last been seen with Marissa and steered clear of conversations about the murder. He drank heavily in those early months, drowning out memories of her face. But when no police came knocking, his confidence slowly returned. Over the next decade, Kessler became adept at reinventing himself. He never stayed in one job for long. One year he worked in construction, the next in landscaping, then as a mechanic. His pattern was simple. When questions got too personal or when someone started noticing his temper, he quit and moved on. Yet he always circled back to Sedalia. No matter where he went, Flagstaff, Tucson, or short stints in New Mexico, he always returned to the town where his crime had been committed. Perhaps he believed familiarity offered safety. Or perhaps his ego convinced him that he was smarter than the police. Kessler never married, though he had several relationships over the years. To those women, he came across as quiet, sometimes brooding, but capable of charm when he chose. Early girlfriends described him as attentive at first but increasingly controlling. One woman who dated him briefly in 2008 later told investigators, "He had this way of shutting down if you asked too many questions. Like a wall went up. And if he got angry, it was scary. I left fast." Still, none suspected he was capable of murder. To most, he was just a man with a difficult personality. Despite his flaws, Kessler knew how to blend in. He attended barbecues, waved at neighbors, even offered to help fix cars or fences. People often described him as the kind of guy who kept to himself but was reliable when you needed a hand. He never stood out in crowds, and that invisibility became his greatest weapon. In a small town, people noticed extremes, either the overly friendly or the suspiciously reclusive. Kessler hovered somewhere in between, unnoticed and unremarkable. He built a modest life, renting small houses, driving used trucks, and living paycheck to paycheck. He never drew too much attention to himself financially or socially. But while his exterior seemed steady, Inside, Kessler carried the weight of his crime. He rarely spoke about the past and avoided any mention of Marissa's name. On anniversaries of her death, he drank heavily, sometimes disappearing for days. Former co-workers recalled that he occasionally lashed out with sudden bursts of anger. One mechanic who worked alongside him remembered, he could be fine one moment, then slam tools against the wall the next. It was like something inside him was boiling all the time. Investigators later theorized that these outbursts were rooted in his suppressed guilt. Though he never confessed to anyone, the secret gnawed at him, shaping his relationships and keeping him isolated. There were times when Kessler almost slipped. In 2010, when police briefly revisited Marissa's case with new leads, he grew noticeably anxious. A neighbor recalled seeing him chain-smoking on his porch for days. When the case fizzled again, his confidence returned. In 2016, when national news reported a surge in cold cases being solved by DNA genealogy, he reportedly muttered to a coworker, "They should just leave the past alone." At the time, the comment seemed odd but harmless. Only years later would it make sense. Despite his internal struggles, Kessler managed to maintain a mask of normalcy. He was active in small ways around town, fixing cars at the auto shop, stopping by the hardware store, even attending local fairs. Children in the neighborhood sometimes waved at him as he worked on his truck, and he would wave back. Parents saw nothing threatening in him. That was perhaps the most chilling part. He lived among them, unnoticed, even trusted. After his arrest in 2025, detectives pieced together the fragments of his life. They discovered a man who had never built lasting roots. No long-term relationships, no steady career, no close friendships. His life was defined by avoidance and survival. When interviewed by psychologist consultants, experts noted that Kessler likely compartmentalized the murder. He locked it in a box in his mind, one expert explained. As long as no one opened that box, he could function. But the guilt seeped out in his temper, his isolation, and his inability to form deep bonds. For the people of Sedalia, the greatest shock was realizing that Kessler had been right there all along. Many knew him by name, had hired him for odd jobs, or exchanged pleasantries at the store. Some parents admitted they had once trusted him to drive their kids to school events. One neighbor told reporters after the arrest, "I let him into my home. My kids sat on his lap when he gave them candy. To know what he did to Marissa, it makes me sick." For 25 years, Graham Kessler lived a life of illusion, ordinary on the outside, monstrous within. His ability to hide in plain sight was not because he was brilliant, but because the cracks in the system had allowed him to slip through. He was not a ghost nor a drifter. He was a man who attended the same grocery stores, drove the same roads, and lived alongside the very people who feared Marissa's killer might still be among them. And he was. By the time of his arrest in 2025, the facade had crumbled. Neighbors looked back and realized the signs had been there all along. The temper, the secrecy, the way he always seemed to avoid talking about his past. Now the mask was gone. The truth was out. And as he sat in a county jail awaiting trial, the community prepared to confront the reality that one of their own had stolen Marissa Talcott's life. On the morning of April 12, 2025, Sedalia woke to sirens. At first, it seemed like just another police call, but this was different. Within minutes, news spread across town. After 25 years of silence, the man accused of killing Marissa Talcott had been arrested. In the weeks leading up to that morning, Detective Lila Moreno and her team had built an airtight case. The DNA match was undeniable, the genealogy records pointed directly to Kessler, and surveillance confirmed his identity. Still, Moreno knew the arrest had to be handled carefully. Kessler had lived undetected for decades, and there was no telling how he might react once cornered. A pre-dawn operation was planned to minimize risk. Officers studied the layout of his modest one-story home on the edge of Sedalia, noting points of entry and escape. "We had one shot," Moreno later explained. "We couldn't let him slip away again." At 6 a.m., a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into Kessler's neighborhood. Officers in tactical gear surrounded the house. Neighbors peered through blinds, startled by the sudden presence of law enforcement. Moreno herself stood at the front, heart pounding. She had spent months breathing life back into Marissa's case. This was the moment it all converged. She raised her fist and knocked firmly on the door. "Sedalia Police. Graham Kessler, we have a warrant for your arrest." "Open the door." Inside movement. A light flicked on. Moments later, the door creaked open, and there he stood, now 46, hair streaked with gray, eyes narrowed with confusion. "What's this about?" he muttered. "Graham Kessler," Moreno said evenly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Marissa Talcott." For a split second, silence hung in the air. Then officers stepped forward, pulling his arms behind his back as handcuffs clicked into place. Kessler did not resist. Neighbors who gathered outside later recalled how eerily calm he seemed. He didn't fight, didn't shout, one said. He just looked empty. But beneath that composure was shock. After 25 years of hiding, he had grown certain he was safe. The sudden collapse of that illusion was written all over his face. Officers led him down the front steps, past stunned onlookers. Some gasped, others whispered. One neighbor shook his head in disbelief. I let that man fix my truck last year. I never imagined. Within hours, news crews descended on Sedalia. Headlines flashed across local and national outlets. Cold case solved. Suspect arrested in 2000 murder of Arizona woman. DNA breakthrough identifies Marissa Talcott's killer. Community stunned by arrest of longtime resident. Cameras captured Moreno's press conference outside the police department. Today, we announced the arrest of Graham Kessler for the murder of Marissa Talcott, she declared. This arrest demonstrates the power of persistence, science, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Behind her, a poster-sized photo of Marissa reminded everyone what this was about. When Moreno called the Talcott family just after the arrest, the conversation was raw with emotion. Helen Talcott wept openly. You did it, you really did it. Thank you for not giving up on her. David Talcott was more subdued. He sat in silence, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Finally, he whispered, after all these years, finally. Evan Talcott, now a father himself, broke down in tears. I can tell my kids that their aunt didn't die forgotten. She mattered. For the Talcotts, the arrest did not bring Marissa back, but it shattered the hopelessness that had haunted them for a quarter century. Sedalia was shaken. For years, residents had speculated about Marissa's killer. Was it an outsider, a drifter, a jealous boyfriend? Few had guessed it was the quiet man fixing cars just down the street. At local diners and grocery stores, conversations buzzed with disbelief. I saw him every week, one resident said. How could we not have known? For others, the arrest brought guilt. Some remembered seeing Kessler with Marissa the night she vanished but had dismissed it as unimportant. We thought the police would handle it, one witness admitted. Now I wonder if speaking louder back then could have saved her. After his arrest, Kessler was brought to the county jail for questioning. Moreno sat across from him, studying his face. For hours he refused to speak, staring blankly at the wall. Finally, when confronted with the DNA evidence, his composure cracked. That doesn't prove anything, he muttered, though his voice trembled. Moreno leaned forward. It proves you were there, Graham. It proves Marissa fought you. It proves you didn't get away with it, not forever. He said nothing more. When retired Detective Raymond Calderon heard the news, he drove into Sedalia just to see the moment for himself. Standing outside the police station, he watched as officers escorted Kessler inside. Tears filled his eyes. I carried her case in my heart every day, he told reporters. To see this moment, it's bittersweet. But it's justice. That evening, Sedalia's town square filled with people holding candles, just as they had in the years following Marissa's death. This time, however, the mood was different. There was still grief, but also relief and a sense of victory. Helen spoke softly to the crowd. For 25 years, I lit this candle in hope. Tonight, I light it in gratitude, to the detectives who never gave up, and to everyone who remembered my daughter. Justice has finally begun. The crowd erupted in applause, candles glowing brightly against the desert night. The arrest of Graham Kessler marked a turning point, not just for the Talcott family but for the entire community. It proved that even the coldest cases could be solved, that time could not erase truth, and that persistence mattered. For Sedalia, the fear that had lingered for decades began to lift. Parents told their children the story of Marissa Talcott not just as a warning, but as a testament to justice delayed, not denied. And for Kessler, the walls of freedom that had surrounded him for 25 years finally collapsed. He was no longer the quiet neighbor or the helpful mechanic. He was a man exposed, accused, and awaiting trial for the murder he thought he had buried in the desert. The arrest of Graham Kessler in April 2025 was only the beginning. Within weeks, the case moved into the courts, where decades of grief and unanswered questions finally collided with the machinery of justice. On April 20, 2025, Kessler was formally indicted on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. Prosecutor Ethan Rose stood before the cameras and delivered a firm statement. For 25 years, the Talcott family has waited for this moment. The evidence is clear, the science is undeniable, and we are prepared to seek the maximum penalty under law. Kessler was ordered held without bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. The trial began in late summer, held in the Maricopa County Superior Court. Every day the courtroom filled with journalists, townspeople, and Marissa's supporters. The Talcott family occupied the front row, clutching photos of Marissa. Judge Margaret Ellison, a no-nonsense figure known for her fairness, presided over the case. She reminded the jury, "This is about evidence, not speculation. You will hear painful testimony, but your task is to weigh the facts." Prosecutor Ethan Rowe opened with a powerful statement. On April 18, 2000, Marissa Talcott was alive. She was 25 years old, full of dreams, loved by her family. Less than 12 hours later, she was dead, strangled, and left in a desert wash. The man responsible is seated in this courtroom today, Graham Kessler. Rowe outlined the evidence. DNA under Marissa's fingernails matched Kessler. The cigarette butt near her body carried Kessler's DNA. Witnesses placed him with Marissa at the diner the night she vanished. Records showed he lived in Sedalia at the time and fit the suspect description given in 2000. Rowe emphasized the brutality of the crime. This was not random. Marissa fought for her life. And in fighting, she left us the very evidence that convicts her killer. Kessler's defense attorney, Caleb Dwyer, took a different angle. He argued the DNA evidence, while compelling, did not prove murder. "Yes, my client's DNA was found," Dwyer admitted. "But DNA only proves presence, not guilt. He was at the diner with Marissa. They spoke, they shared a cigarette outside. That explains the DNA. It does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed her." He painted Kessler as a scapegoat, a man whose life was being destroyed by circumstantial evidence and the state's desperation to close a cold case. But the jury's eyes often drifted back to the Talcott family, their grief palpable, their presence a reminder of what had been lost. The courtroom heard from a long line of witnesses. Tanya Whitford, Marissa's best friend, testified about their final phone call. Her voice cracked as she described Marissa's excitement about nursing school. She was planning her future. She didn't know she was walking into her death that night. Rachel DeLeon and Marta Keene, Marissa's co-workers, spoke of her character and confirmed her work schedule that day. The diner employee from 2000 took the stand, recalling the image burned into her memory, Marissa sitting with Kessler, looking tense. She didn't look happy. She looked like she wanted to leave. Forensic experts explained the DNA matches in detail, walking the jury through how modern technology provided certainty that 2000 labs could not. The most emotional testimony came from the Talcott family. Helen Talcott spoke first. Clutching a photo of her daughter, she told the jury, "For 25 years, I woke every morning hoping this day would come. I want you to see Marissa not as a case file but as my child. She loved life. She deserved so much more." David Talcott followed, his voice steady but heavy. "I planted a garden for my daughter because it was the only way I could keep her memory alive. I ask you to plant justice in her name." Evan Talcott, now 42, fought back tears as he described the night he searched with a flashlight, desperate to find his sister. "I was just a kid. I thought if I looked hard enough I could bring her back. But she never came home. Please don't let her go unheard again." Jurors wiped tears as the family spoke. Dwyer cross-examined each witness carefully, trying to sow doubt. He suggested the diner employee's memory was unreliable after 25 years. He questioned whether contamination could have occurred in the DNA samples stored for decades. But each time, experts countered firmly, the evidence was solid. The chain of custody was intact. The science was undeniable. Throughout the trial, Graham Kessler sat quietly, expressionless. He rarely looked at the Talcott family, instead staring at the table in front of him. Occasionally he whispered to his attorney, but he never took the stand in his own defense. To the jury, his silence spoke volumes. Rowe closed with fire. Marissa Talcott left us the truth in her final moments. She fought, and in fighting she carried her killer's DNA under her fingernails. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence points in one direction, and one direction only, to the man sitting here. Dwyer countered, urging the jury not to be swayed by emotion. Do not convict a man simply because the story is tragic. Convict only if you believe the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt. And here there is doubt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Outside, the Talcotts and community members gathered anxiously, candles flickering in vigil. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, waiting for the verdict. When the jury returned, the air inside the courtroom grew heavy. Judge Ellison asked for the decision. The foreperson stood, voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendant, Graham Kessler, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of tampering with evidence. The courtroom erupted. Helen collapsed into David's arms, sobbing. Evan bowed his head, whispering, "We did it, Marissa." Supporters hugged each other, tears streaming. Kessler sat stone-faced as deputies moved to escort him out. For the first time in 25 years he was no longer free. The guilty verdict in state of Arizona versus Graham Kessler sent waves of relief and heartbreak through Sedalia. For 25 years, the town had lived under the shadow of Marissa Talcott's unsolved murder. Now, with the jury's decision, that shadow began to lift. But justice, while powerful, could never erase the pain of what had been lost. On November 4, 2025, the courthouse was once again packed. This time it was not for deliberation but for sentencing. Judge Margaret Ellison presided over the proceedings, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the courtroom. The jury has spoken. The evidence is clear. Today this court delivers justice long overdue. Prosecutor Ethan Rowe pushed for the maximum sentence. Life in prison without parole. The defendant stole a life, Rowe declared. He robbed a family, a community, and a young woman of everything she could have been. Mercy is not deserved here. Defense attorney Caleb Dwyer argued for leniency, suggesting Kessler's lack of criminal history since 2000 demonstrated rehabilitation. But his words rang hollow. When Kessler was given the chance to speak, he declined. He sat stone-faced, refusing to look at the Talcott family. Judge Ellison delivered her ruling. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. This court finds that justice delayed is not justice denied, she said. The memory of Marissa Talcott deserves nothing less than the fullest measure of accountability. Before sentencing, the Talcott family addressed the court. Helen Talcott stood first, clutching her daughter's photograph. Her voice trembled, but her words were sharp. You thought you buried her story in the desert, but her truth lived on. For 25 years, I carried her with me, waiting for this day. And now, you will carry the weight of what you did for the rest of your life. David Talcott followed, his tone quieter but equally powerful. I built a garden to keep her memory alive. Today, I hope that memory lives beyond our home and in the hearts of everyone who hears her story. Justice does not heal us, but it honors her. Evan Talcott, now a father of two, wiped tears as he faced Kessler. My children will know their aunt as a woman who mattered, not as a name in a cold case file. You took her from me, but you did not erase her. Today proves that. The courtroom fell silent as the family returned to their seats. The sentencing reverberated across Sedalia. Local newspapers ran front-page stories. Justice at last. Kessler sentenced for 2000 murder of Talcott. Sedalia finds closure after 25-year wait at the town square. Candles once again flickered in Marissa's honor. This time, however, the vigil carried a new feeling, relief. Residents spoke openly about how the verdict had lifted a weight from the community. For younger generations, the case became more than a cautionary tale. It was a lesson in resilience, in never giving up, in the power of science and determination. Teachers at Sedalia High even shared Marissa's story in civic classes, using it to teach about justice and perseverance. Following sentencing, Graham Kessler was transferred to the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, where he would spend the rest of his life. Reporters covering his arrival noted his unchanged demeanor, cold, silent, and unrepentant. He gave no statement, no apology. To many, that only deepened the sense that justice had been necessary and overdue. In Sedalia, his name quickly became taboo. Neighbors who once waved to him at the grocery store now spoke of him only with disgust. His home was sold and his belongings auctioned. It was as though the town was erasing him from its memory, leaving space only for Marissa's story. For the Talcotts, life after the trial was bittersweet. Helen often said, "Justice is not the same as peace, but it helps us breathe again." She continued hosting the annual candlelight vigil each April, but now with a new tone, one of remembrance rather than desperation. David tended his garden with renewed purpose, planting new flowers each season in Marissa's honor. Evan, who had spent much of his adult life advocating for victims' families, began to write a book about his sister's case. It's not just about what happened to her, he said. It's about how we survived the silence and how others can too. The resolution of Marissa's case had ripple effects beyond Sedalia. Law enforcement officials across Arizona pointed to it as a model of persistence and the value of investing in cold case units. Detective Lila Moreno became a symbol of that persistence, hailed for her dogged pursuit of justice. At conferences, she often said, "Every file represents a family waiting in the dark. If we can bring one family into the light, it's worth every hour." The case also highlighted the power of forensic science. DNA evidence that once seemed inconclusive in 2000 had become the very key to solving the crime in 2025. Across the country, cold cases were reopened with renewed vigor. Despite the guilty verdict and life sentence, the Talcott family grappled with mixed emotions. Relief and gratitude coexisted with grief and anger. Helen admitted, "I wanted to see him apologize. I wanted him to say Marissa's name. But he never did. That's something I'll carry forever." David put it differently, "Justice doesn't mean you stop hurting. It means the hurting finally has a name, and that name is guilty." For Evan, the verdict brought a sense of responsibility. If my sister's story can give hope to other families waiting for answers, then maybe her life still carries forward. Maybe that's the closest thing to justice we can find. In the end, the story of Marissa Talcott became one of both tragedy and triumph. Her life, though stolen, inspired resilience in her family and determination in those who fought for her justice. Her name was etched not only into her gravestone but into the collective memory of Sedalia. Each April, when the town gathered with candles, it was no longer in fear or sorrow alone. It was in recognition of a young woman whose light had outlasted the darkness that tried to snuff it out. Sedalia would never be the same. But it was no longer defined by the silence of an unsolved crime. It was defined by the courage to keep Marissa's memory alive, the science that finally cracked the case, and the relentless pursuit of truth that brought her killer to justice. Justice had not erased the pain, but it had given the Talcotts and their town something invaluable: the chance to finally step out from under the shadow and into the light of closure. When the gavel struck in November 2025, sentencing Graham Kessler to life without parole, it marked the official end of a decades-long fight. But for the Talcotts, for Sedalia, and for countless others who followed the case, the story of Marissa Talcott did not end there. Instead, it became something larger, a lesson in perseverance, in justice delayed but not denied, and in the resilience of the human spirit. For 25 years, the Talcott family carried an unbearable weight. Each candle lit at a vigil was a flicker of hope against overwhelming darkness. Every phone call that went unanswered by police, every lead that turned into a dead end could have crushed them. Yet they persisted. Helen refused to stop asking questions. David kept Marissa's memory alive in his garden. Evan turned his grief into advocacy. Their persistence ensured Marissa was never forgotten, and when technology finally caught up, their patience met its reward. Their story showed the world that even when justice seems out of reach, it is worth holding on. Detective Raymond Calderon, though retired by the time the case was solved, became part of Marissa's legacy. His early work preserved witness statements and evidence that would later prove invaluable. Though he carried guilt for years, the resolution brought him a sense of closure. And Detective Lila Moreno, who cracked the case open, became a symbol of hope. She often told reporters, "Marissa fought for her life, and that fight gave us the evidence we needed. It was my job to listen to what she left behind." Moreno's persistence set an example for law enforcement everywhere. No file should ever be considered too old, no case too cold. At the heart of the breakthrough was science, specifically, the evolution of DNA testing and genetic genealogy. In 2000, the technology was too limited to identify Kessler. By 2025, it became the very tool that exposed him. Forensic experts called the case a landmark example of how evidence, no matter how small or degraded, can tell the truth decades later. Across the nation, other families with unsolved cases looked to Marissa's story as a sign that answers might still be possible. Sedalia was never the same after Marissa's death. For years, fear lingered. Parents warned their children with hushed voices, and rumors swirled about who the killer might be. But after Kessler's arrest and conviction, something shifted. The town began to reclaim its identity, not as the place where a young woman was murdered, but as the place where justice eventually prevailed. The candlelight vigils continued, but now they carried an air of hope. The community rallied around the Talcotts, proving that even in tragedy, unity could rise from the ashes of fear. Justice, however, is never simple. The guilty verdict and life sentence did not erase the Talcotts' grief. Helen still cried when she passed Marissa's old bedroom. David still sat quietly in the garden, staring at the flowers he planted in her memory. Evan still carried the weight of being the little brother who could not protect her. But justice transformed their grief. It gave it shape. It gave it closure. Instead of wondering who, they could finally say him. Instead of fearing silence, they could point to truth. As David put it, it doesn't heal the wound, but it stops it from bleeding. At the center of it all was Marissa herself. She was not defined by her murder but by the life she lived, the laughter she shared with friends, the care she gave her patients, the dreams she held for the future. Her story became a beacon. Local schools established a scholarship in her name for aspiring nurses. Her co-workers at the Sedalia Medical Clinic planted a memorial garden on the clinic grounds. At her grave, fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by people who never even knew her personally. Through these gestures, Marissa's life continued to ripple outward, touching lives long after she was gone. The case highlighted critical lessons for society. Never give up on the truth. Even when cases go cold, persistence can lead to breakthroughs. Science evolves. What is inconclusive today may be conclusive tomorrow. Evidence must be preserved. Community matters. Support, unity, and remembrance keep victims alive in collective memory. Evil hides in plain sight. Kessler's ability to live undetected was a sobering reminder of the importance of vigilance. For families of other cold case victims, Marissa's story became a rallying cry. Keep fighting, keep asking, keep hoping. In the years following the trial, journalists, authors, and documentary filmmakers told Marissa's story. Her case appeared on national true crime programs, sparking renewed interest in solving other long-forgotten cases. Evan's book, A Light That Wouldn't Go Out, chronicled his family's journey. It became a bestseller, inspiring families across the country to continue pressing for answers in their own tragedies. Through it all, the Talcotts emphasized one message: Marissa was not just a victim. She was a person who mattered, and her life, though cut short, continued to inspire. In April 2026, 1 year after Kessler's arrest, Sedalia gathered once again in the town square for the annual vigil. But this time, the candles flickered in triumph rather than despair. Helen stood at the podium, her voice steady. For 25 years, we carried the weight of silence. But silence was not the end of our story. Justice found us. And Marissa's light never went out. It shines in all of you who remember her. As the crowd lifted their candles high, the desert night glowed with warmth. It was not just a memorial. It was a celebration of resilience, of justice, and of a young woman whose name would never again fade into the background. Marissa's case changed more than a town. It changed lives far beyond Arizona. Other families saw her story and found courage to demand action on their own cold cases. Lawmakers pushed for more funding for forensic labs. Police departments expanded cold case units, citing Marissa's case as proof of what could be achieved. Her legacy became a symbol of both tragedy and triumph. A reminder that evil can hide, but it cannot always escape. For the Talcotts, the journey was long and painful. They had lived through silence, suspicion, and despair. But they had also lived to see the truth come out, the guilty held accountable, and their daughter's name carried forward with honor. In the end, justice was not just a verdict or a sentence. It was a story reclaimed, a life remembered, and a light that would never again be extinguished.